Welcome, everybody. I didn't know you could get this many people out, but certainly Secretary Rice is an inspiration to us all, a great draw. Let me say hello to Valerie Jarrett, one of our heroes in the White House. Thank you for coming, Ms. Jarrett. And let's leap right on in, although I will say that we're very proud to have you as a new board member of the Aspen Institute.
Thank you.
So
thank you very much,
for
Walter.
being part of it.
Great.
Thank Joe and Alma Gildenhorn for helping put this together. And there are actually two books, but they're very similar, and they're both for sale this afternoon. It's basically a memoir starting in Birmingham up until the day you go into the second Bush administration.
That's right.
And it's absolutely fascinating. But why don't we start? Just tell me about your neighborhood in Birmingham, which is so richly described in the book.
Well, I grew up in a little suburb of Birmingham, a suburb meaning that it was maybe 10 minutes from downtown Birmingham in those days, called Titusville. And it was a little middle-class community, all black, of course. And Birmingham's children in this community were the center of attention. The community was decidedly middle class. I think there was one doctor, there was one lawyer, and everybody else taught school.
Right.
And so it was a place where education was everything. You had to be at church on Sunday, you had to be at school, and then you had to be in some kind of activity almost every waking hour, whether it was ballet lessons or piano lessons or something. So it was a very achievement-oriented little community.
Well, Titusville is famous in the Old South. And in some ways it was interesting because there was sort of a class structure among the black community there.
Yes.
And your mother was sort of more patrician than some.
That's right. Well, more patrician certainly than my father's family, because my mother's family was landowning, and landowning in a pretty big way. My grandfather was a coal mining engineer, had actually, interestingly, been raised by a white family. This is one of those strange stories of America and race.
Let's start with your granddaddy, because
yes,
he runs
right.
away. I mean, he runs away.
He runs away. This is my father's, my mother's father. He ran away when he was 13. And the family lore is that he had assaulted a white man with a tire iron because that man had assaulted his sister. And so he ran away. He was in a train station in the wee hours of the morning, and this white man came by and said, "What are you doing here?" And he explained the situation, and this man took him home and raised him with his sons. This man's name was Mr. Wheeler, and the way that I knew that this story had a lot of resonance with my family was on the day that my grandfather died. My parents and I went home to tell my grandmother that my grandfather had died at the hospital, and she said, "Somebody call the Wheeler boys." That was the first, those were the first people that she called.
And his last words were something about a train whistle, right?
His last words to my mother were, "Angelina, we're on this train alone," because he always said that a train whistle made him feel lonely, having had that experience as a young boy. My grandmother, on my mother's side, was the daughter of most probably an African Methodist Episcopal bishop, and some of you will know what that means. The AME Church, yes. The AME Church was huge. And my grandmother, as a matter of fact, on my mother's side, was sent off to finishing school at St. Mark's Academy. I have a wonderful picture of her in the book and all dolled up for her graduation. She was taught piano by a Viennese master. And my grandparents were just hardworking people. They owned their own home. They built their own home. They owned a lot of land. But my father's side of the family, my grandmother was a half Creole and left home when she was 17 to marry my father, my grandfather. My grandfather has probably the most interesting story in this whole
This is the Baton Rouge grandfather?
This is the Baton Rouge
Louisiana people have to
you have to get that in.
Yeah, right.
Well, actually, he was born in Utah. That would be spelled E-U-T-A-W, Alabama.
How else would you spell Utah?
He is from the South.
It's a great Indian tribe.
It's a great Indian tribe. And my grandfather, when he was a young man, decided he wanted to get book learning in a college. And so at 19, he asked how colored men could go to college. They told him about Little Stillman College, which was 30 miles away. And so he saved up his cotton. He went off to college. And after 1 year, he didn't have any more money or any more cotton. And they said, "So you'll have to leave. And he said, well, how are those boys going to college? They said, well, they have what's called a scholarship, and if you wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, then you could have a scholarship too. And Granddaddy said exactly what I had in mind. And my family has been college educated, and by the way, Presbyterian ever since. So those were my grandparents, but my grandfather on my father's side led the life of a kind of itinerant preacher. He would go from Louisiana to Alabama to Mississippi. He'd found a school here, a church here, and a school next door. And he was a kind of educational evangelist, just going from place to place, founding schools to educate
And your father
kids.
had the great Presbyterian church in Birmingham.
My father took over, my grandfather actually founded Westminster Presbyterian Church in the 1940s. And my father then became first the assistant pastor, and after he finished seminary at Johnson C. Smith University, he became the pastor of that church.
And they kind of push you early on at age 3, right? They're trying to make you go to school.
Now, the book actually starts with this because when I was 3, my parents decided it was time for me to enter first grade. So my mother taught high school, and across the campus there was an elementary school. And so they walked me into class the first day, and I was terrified of Mrs. Jones and of the other children, and I wouldn't stay. And they repeated this day after day after day, and I would not stay. And finally, I said to my mother, and I don't know where I came up with this, the reason I don't want to go to that lady's class is she wears the same skirt every day.
You made it up.
I made it up.
Yeah.
But that seemed to get their attention. And so from then on, I stayed at my grandmother's house during the day while my parents taught school.
And also, your father wanted you to be a football star.
Well, the deal was when they found out that my mother was pregnant, that was in the days before ultrasound could tell you what the gender of the baby was going to be. So had I been a boy, I was going to be named John, and I was going to be an All-American linebacker. My father had already bought the sports equipment and everything. My mother got to name the girl, and she wanted an Italian musical term. There are a lot of Italian names in my family. There's an Italian ancestor back there. Angelina, my mother's name. Genoa, my aunt's name, although we call her Genoa because we're from the South. And my Uncle Alto. So Italian names. My mother decided that andantino, which she loved, meant walking slowly. Didn't like the implications of that. Allegro meant fast. Definitely didn't like the implications of that. And so she found Condoleezza, which meant with sweetness, and she changed the ending so that the English ear could pronounce it.
Well, great. That's sweet, as they say. Exactly. To get back a little bit to racing class, if I may, in Birmingham. So he runs a Presbyterian church, which is sort of high-minded, but he actually then wants to reach out.
This is something that I learned a lot in interviewing people about my parents. My family is not great record keepers. We had a couple of family Bibles. None of us ever wrote letters, and so I didn't have a treasure trove of documents to deal with. So I decided to interview people who had known my parents either as their students or their co-workers, and church members. And one of the things that I learned, I had known about it vaguely. So my father, in his middle-class congregation, again, mostly teachers, behind the church there was a government project, as they called it in the day, called Loveman Village. And Loveman Village had, obviously a lot of poor families. And my father believed very strongly that those kids in Loveman Village should take advantage of the youth fellowship programs that he had at his church, where they had tutoring in algebra and French lessons and even etiquette classes where we learned to use the right fork, that kind of thing. And I see Mary Bush out there. Mary was a member of my father's youth fellowship. And Mary was from the, kind of the middle class part of Birmingham.
But you were from Titusville, were you?
Yes, she was. She is. She was from Titusville.
Titusville.
Right around the corner, around the corner from me.
Because there's the other neighborhood, right?
But the Loveman Village was the poor neighborhood. Titusville.
No, there was another middle class.
Smithville was the other one. So, in any case, my father really wanted to include these kids in his programs, and this was a scandal in his church. And he would do it anyway, but his elders cut off money for his, as they called them, social programs at one point. And he got so angry. My father was a big physical man, not physical with me or my mother, but physical. And he turned over the table and stormed out of his elders' meeting and went and got the women of his church, the Presbyterian Women's Council, which is a very powerful thing in Presbyterian churches, to fund his programs, which the elders would not. But he came home one night and he was very upset because these kids from Loveman Village apparently had been caught out back at a church picnic teaching the church children how to shoot craps. And one of his elders had said, "Reverend Rice, we told you that they weren't ready to be with us." So class tensions could be pretty high in Birmingham.
Yeah, it's particularly interesting as you go into the 60s and you have that. But before we get to 63, let's do 62, which is kind of interesting because the Cuban Missile Crisis has an impact on you.
Yes. My father was very interested in politics and history, and the family routine every night was to sit and watch the Huntley-Brinkley Report, which we just loved, and that was how we got our news, and my father would discuss the stories. And I realized that something very serious was going on when in October I heard about these missiles that the Soviets had put in Cuba. And it was a very tense time because, probably erroneously, the Birmingham newscasters were saying that Birmingham was in the range of these missiles, you know, with big arrows pointing at Birmingham.
I remember that
You remember that local thing.
We in New Orleans always felt bad because Birmingham was higher on the target list.
Exactly.
Because it had Huntsville and
all of that.
Yeah.
So if you're a kid, this is kind of scary. This is something your parents can't save you from. And I remember my father said the United States of America had never lost a war and wasn't going to lose one now, he was quite sure. But he was obviously relieved when the Cuban Missile Crisis was over and the Soviet ships turned around. But I said I was speaking to a group of Cuban Americans, and somebody asked me about beginning to loosen the embargo with Cuba, and I said, Fidel Castro put the United States at risk by putting those missiles in Cuba, and he ought to pay for it till the day he dies. And I thought, where did that come from?
Yeah, it comes from you. Oh, wow.
And I have a feeling that it in part came from this early experience of my first real fear being around the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Was that your first sort of exposure to international relations?
It was really. I remember very, very vaguely John F. Kennedy going to Berlin, but I mostly remember.
But it got you interested?
It got me interested, right.
Now, of course, 62, around that same time, they're doing, I think, the Birmingham boycott of the downtown stores.
That's right. The people of Birmingham organized themselves. I mean, 62 and 63 were crucible years, but really the civil rights struggle in Birmingham has a much longer history of that, of people trying to organize themselves. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who is one of my heroes, and I think never got enough credit. You know, the great national leader.
He ran the NAACP chapter in Birmingham.
NAACP chapter in Birmingham, when they outlawed that, he started the Birmingham Committee for Human Rights. He was a real hero, and even though the great national heroes, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, are the ones we remember, Fred Shuttlesworth was the heart and soul of the Birmingham movement. And one of the things that they organized was a boycott of downtown Birmingham stores because there was racial signage, you know, no coloreds in here. They obviously had no workers, no clerks who were black.
Well, let me divert you to make it personal.
Yeah.
Don't you go to a downtown store with your mother, and your mother refuses to let them not let you in the dressing room?
Yes, we go to buy an Easter dress, I'll never forget, and the sales lady says, well, she'll have to try it on in there, pointing to a storeroom. And my mother said, let me be very clear, either she tries it on in there, pointing to the dressing room, or we don't buy this dress. And this poor lady sort of led us into the dressing room, and then she stood outside, you know, thinking I'm sure she was going to lose her job the whole time. But this boycott got organized, and nobody broke the boycott. If you wore older clothes on Easter to show you weren't breaking the boycott. But my parents didn't want, when it came around to Christmas time, didn't want me to be without toys. So they had my aunt in Norfolk buy the dolls and everything and bring them with her.
Oh, that's sweet. And so the Reverend Shuttlesworth, by 63, I think Dr. King is coming into Birmingham
That's
at
right,
that point.
that's right.
What is, I mean, I've read it in the book, but
Yeah.
your father's relationship with Reverend Shuttlesworth and Dr. King?
With Reverend Shuttlesworth, they were very close friends. I can remember them sitting out on the front porch, talking about all of the events, and
You sitting on the lap?
and me sitting on, or jumping up on my father, and my father sort of shooing me away. You know, Reverend Shuttlesworth moved to Cincinnati, but he would come back to Birmingham pretty frequently. And my father lionized Martin Luther King like all black people, but he had real reservations about the civil rights movement, the way that it played out.
He didn't march.
He didn't march. And in fact, a lot of middle-class blacks didn't march. The foot soldiers were the working class. And my father said to my mother, and I'll never forget, I was standing in the hallway of our little house, and they were talking in the living room. And he said, you know, Angelina, he said, they're calling people to march. He said, but I know that if somebody tries to come after me with a billy club, I'm going to try to kill them, and my daughter's going to be an orphan. He didn't believe in meeting violence with nonviolence. He simply didn't. And so he did not march. He also had deep reservations about what came to be known as the Children's March in May of 1963, when Martin Luther King, frustrated with the response of the nation, organized kids as young as 4 or 5 years old to march on City Hall. And without a parade permit, which is the excuse that the Public Safety Commissioner, Bull Connor, used, these children walked right into the teeth of Bull Connor's henchmen. And when Bull Connor over a megaphone said, "Do you have a permit?" and someone said no, the policemen flooded out of the paddy wagons and began to arrest the kids and beat them. And that's the story. Those are the images that you then saw on television. And my father just wasn't on board. He said, I wouldn't have sent my daughter into the teeth of Bull Connor's henchmen, and nobody should have sent those kids into there.
I guess it's September of that year. You're in the Presbyterian Church a Sunday morning. It's about 2 miles away from the 16th Street Baptist Church.
Yes, and we had just gotten to church because my mother was the choir master, and we were there kind of getting ready for church, and all of a sudden there was a shaking and a thud. And in those days in Birmingham, everybody knew that a bomb had gone off. Birmingham was now called Bombingham. And we thought it was perhaps in our community. And a little while later, Mrs. Florence Rice, who was one of my father's great supporters, came in and said that 16th Street Baptist Church had been bombed. People were doing a kind of phone tree because there was fear that all of the churches were being targeted. And shortly after that, they said that in fact it had been in the basement and 4 little girls had been killed. And it wasn't long after that that we knew the names of those little girls. And we knew them all. We lived in the community with them. We're a small community. We knew them all. And Denise McNair had been my kindergarten friend. And there's a picture in the book of my father giving Denise McNair her kindergarten graduation certificate. So it was homegrown terrorism.
Why was your father a Republican?
Well, my father was somebody who always did what it took to get things done. So he and my mother in 1952 go down to register to vote. My mother was fair-skinned and quite beautiful, and the poll tester asked my mother, who's the first president of the United States? And she said, George Washington. He said, fine, you go register. And then he looked at my dark-skinned, very imposing father. My father was 6'2", big man. And he said, how many beans are in this jar? Oh. And my father said he didn't know, and he said, well, you failed the test. So my father went back, and he was telling Mr. Frank Hunter, this old man at his church, and Mr. Hunter said, oh, Reverend, don't worry about it. I'll show you how to get registered. He said, there's a lady down there, she's a clerk, and she's a Republican. And she'll register anybody who'll say they're a Republican. Because it was Dixiecrat Birmingham. Right. The Democrats controlled all. And so my father went down, he registered Republican, he got to register the vote, and he was Republican the rest of his life.
Although oddly so, he votes for Bobby.
He would have voted for Bobby Kennedy. There's
sorry.
no doubt about
Yeah.
it. He would have voted for Bobby Kennedy. But I think he never voted for another Democrat.
And an odd relationship that I found out for the first time by reading the book with Stokely Carmichael?
Yes, my father, after we left Birmingham, he went to be Dean of Students at Stillman College, and he started a speaker series. And the first person he invited to his speaker series was the firebrand head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, Stokely Carmichael. And this caused a huge uproar, and he was called down by the police chief, who said, you know, Reverend, I don't need any riots. Why are you doing this? But after some extra security, he invited Stokely. Stokely did his thing at the Stillman College gym, and everything went fine. My father then, when he moved to Denver, started a speaker series called The Black Experience in America. And because the speakers had a kind of decidedly hard edge, Louis Farrakhan spoke in that class before he went too far off, but he was still the head of the Nation of Islam. He had Stokely Carmichael several times, Dick Gregory. I often wondered why my father, this conservative Presbyterian minister who loved the United States of America with all of his heart, was somehow attracted to these black radicals. And he told me it was because he loved the contestation of ideas. And there's no doubt about it, he liked to mix things up. But I've often thought, too, that he, at some level, admired the way that they confronted racism with a kind of strength rather than a sense of subjugation. And so throughout his life, he found that whole continuum of black politics interesting.
Yeah. You went to New York for a while, drove there, and then to Denver. What was it like leaving segregation, and how different was it?
Well, the first thing is to drive to New York or
up until Washington,
Denver,
at
or what,
least.
you had to make it to Washington before you could stay in a hotel.
Right.
And you had to make it to Washington before you could eat in a restaurant. So you would get up in the morning and you'd make a picnic lunch, as my mother called it, of fried chicken and pork chops and potato chips, things that would last a couple of days because you couldn't stop in a restaurant. And when we moved, then we went to Denver, same thing, you had to get to the other side of the Tennessee border in order to be able to stop. But when we went to Denver that first summer, first of all, I realized for the first time I should have been born in the West because my little heart would just patter as we were crossing the Kansas border. But
I'm sorry, why is that?
I just
Not
loved
the
it.
mountains, obviously,
Yeah,
'cause
yeah.
Kansas
No,
doesn't have the
no,
mountains,
but you'd see the horizon start to go up when
Okay.
you go to Colorado, and I just loved the West. But the activity, my parents were going to graduate school, both of them. My father was doing his master's degree in student personnel administration. My mother was getting credentialed in music. She taught other subjects. The question was, what were we going to do with me, right, during the day? So one day we were coming out of a class, and I saw some figure skaters leaving the skating rink in their little short skirts. And I had watched Henley Albright on TV, and I said, I want to take ice skating lessons. Well, this was immediately a wonderful solution. So ice skating was high-priced childcare. You just dropped me at the rink all day, and I took skating lessons. And I write in the book that when we got ready to go home, I was really sad because I didn't want to leave my friends. And it never occurred to me that for the first time in my life, my friends were white.
Right, right. And then you go back to Denver permanently.
Yes.
Let's talk about Dr. Corbell
Yes.
and how he affected you, and you can even, obviously, most people know the connection of
Yes,
who he is.
yes,
but
Madeline's father, Madeline Albright's father. Well, we went back to Denver. Skating actually got my father the job because one of my little skating friends was a girl named Debbie Mitchell. Her father was the chancellor of the University of Denver. They stood in the parking lot and talked while we skated. When my dad finished his degree, Chancellor Mitchell offered him a job. And so we were going to Denver permanently, and I thought this was terrific. And so I went to St. Mary's Academy, all-girls Catholic school, wore those awful saddle shoes and long socks, the whole thing.
Now, how did your very, very Protestant family allow that?
Well, it was hard because John Wesley Rice Sr., when he would found his schools, particularly in your home state of Louisiana, would often run afoul of the Catholic authorities, and they would then shut down his schools. So my family was militantly Protestant. And my father was just very sad to learn that the best school for his daughter in Denver was St. Mary's Academy. It helped that the nuns were no longer in habits, and you didn't have to take religion classes if you weren't Catholic. But I went to St. Mary's, a great college prep school. My parents and I decided, after they had proposed that I skip my last year of high school, and I counter-proposed that I do my last year of high school and my first year of college at the same time, we developed this hybrid. I went to college in the morning and high school in the afternoon. And by the time I was at the end of my sophomore year in college and a piano major, as had been expected, I went off to the Aspen Music Festival School. And I met 12-year-olds who could play from sight everything it had taken me all year to learn. And I thought, I am going to end up teaching 13-year-olds to murder Beethoven, or maybe playing piano bar someplace, but I'm not playing Carnegie Hall. Yeah. And I went home and I had that conversation with my parents. Mom and Dad, I'm changing my major. What are you changing your major to? I don't know. You don't know what you want to do with your life. It's my life. It's our money. And so I was in desperate search of a major. And I'm now a junior in college. I have no major. And my first attempt is English literature. I hate it. Second is state and local government. My assignment is interview the water manager for the city of Denver, the single most boring man I have met to this day. So state and local government, not it. I wander into a course in international politics taught by Dr. Corbell. And my passion is now very much in front of me. It's things Russians, it's things international. Fortunately, when I went back and said to my parents, I found it, I'm going to be a Soviet specialist, they didn't say, are you kidding me? What's a black girl from Birmingham, Alabama talking about being a Soviet specialist? But that's what I then pursued, thanks to Dr. Corbell.
Right, right. So in some ways, you and Madeline have the same
As
lineage.
she said it, intellectual father.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
right. That's right.
Tell us about the connection to the Aspen Institute, because it's a small parochial question, but that then comes up with Brent and
yes,
others.
well, I have to tell one story in between, because Ambassador Horace Dawson is here. And Ambassador Dawson invited my father in 1976 to be on a panel that was evaluating the USIA. And I met him, of course, Ambassador Dawson, and he said, have you ever considered having a State Department internship? And I said, well, no, I actually hadn't considered that. Not only did he send me the application forms, but he called practically every other day to say, have you filled out that application? Right. That was my first internship in foreign policy. I was a State Department intern in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, and when I became Secretary of State, I told everybody, be good to your interns. You never know what they're going to do. So I was able then to finish my PhD in international politics after doing my master's at Notre Dame, and went to Stanford as a fellow in the Arms Control and Disarmament Program, as it was called. But through a series of important mentors, ended up on the Stanford faculty, where I was giving a seminar, or where Brent Scowcroft was giving a seminar. And I raised my hand. I was an assistant professor, and I raised my hand, and I asked Brent what I now recognize as a slightly rude question about the commission that he was chairing. And he liked that, and he came down and he said, you know, I'd like to get to know you better, and got me involved in the Aspen Strategy Group as a member, where I really got integrated into the foreign policy establishment before then going to serve George H.W. Bush in 1989.
There's a picture we now have, I don't know if you've seen it right outside, where you look pretty much the same, but Joe Nye has a lot of hair, Brent has a lot of hair, and you're sitting there making a point, and they're listening to you 15, 20 years ago. This book is awesomely good and very personal. I mean, very much so. And I'm going to ask you only one personal question, but it's from the book. Rick Upchurch. Oh, yeah. You said you almost married him.
Well, maybe. I thought so. Look, I have said in the book that I've been asked many, many times, so didn't you want to get married? Well, of course I would have liked to have gotten married, but you don't get married in the abstract. You know, you actually want to marry somebody. And with the exception of Rick, who was a professional football player, a punt returner and wide receiver for the Denver Broncos, where it just didn't work out in the final analysis. I just haven't found anybody that I want to marry. But who knows?
Well, that's what Aspen is all about. We've had trustees marry each other recently, so we can,
You have,
heaven
that's
knows what we
right.
can do. I know we haven't gotten to some of the foreign policy stuff in the book, but I do want to open up. But before I do, I know you were just, according to the news, invited to the White House.
Yes.
And I think it was sort of last minute because I noticed you missed a book signing somewhere.
Yes, yes.
And I also know you can't possibly say, the discussions of substance you had with the president, but maybe give us a sense and a flavor of it. And
Yes.
what it was just the two of you, and it was
Yes,
just
and I think it's important to realize that presidents from time to time do invite cabinet secretaries back, particularly on the foreign policy side. The good thing is, I think on foreign policy, despite the fact that there are changes and tussles and here and there still is a foreign policy community that believes that foreign policy ought to be a bipartisan affair. And the president was kind enough to invite me just to talk about a whole range of issues. We kind of covered the waterfront. And to talk about some of the challenges that we have. And I very much appreciated that opportunity. I also gave him a copy of Extraordinary Ordinary People, a memoir of family. And for the girls, I gave him a copy of the young adult version. But I very much enjoyed the conversation, and I think it's really great that he reached out in that way. And I think it's great that we have a foreign policy community that responds across the
there
aisle.
actually has been a lot of continuity. I mean, what you tried to do on the Palestinian-Israeli issue with our
yes.
Middle East
Yes,
investment
which
and
Aspen
Palestinian
was very
partnership
involved in, yes.
is still moving
Going
along,
forward.
and the parameters of the talks that they're trying to get is still along the
Yes,
lines.
yes, yes.
So do you feel there's been sort of a continuity in foreign policy?
I do. Look, every president does things differently, and that's what elections are about. I think the underlying interests of the United States don't change. I think the underlying alliances of the United States don't really change. And unfortunately, the challenges are passed from one successive administration to another. Sometimes, and I've thought a lot about this, sometimes you're lucky enough to be at the end of a big historical epoch.
1989.
1989
Whoa,
to
you were there.
1991. I was in the White House on November 9th, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. So I was in the White House on 11/9. But I had to realize that that was actually the culmination of good policy decisions taken in 1946 and 47 and 48 and 49, when things didn't look so good for the triumph of freedom. And I was in the White House on 9/11, which was the beginning of another big historical epoch, when we, for the first time, had to deal with and reckon with a shadowy network of terrorists who could, we estimated about $100,000, kill 3,000 Americans, 3,000 people, many of them foreign, and violate the territory of the United States in ways that I think we never really thought possible. And the country has been adjusting to that reality since September 11th. And just as I hope, just as there were good decisions taken in 46 and 47 and 48 that led to the eventual triumph in 1991, I hope that we took good decisions in 2001 and 2002, and those decisions are still being taken, so that one day we'll end this historical epoch too.
It took 40 years for the last
That's
epoch
right.
to end. You think we'll be triumphant, that freedom will triumph?
I do, because I have a lot of faith in the power of freedom. I have a lot of faith in the power of the United States and the American people to make something that one day seemed impossible just seem inevitable the next day, whether it is the defeat, out and out defeat of the Soviet Union, so that on December 25th, 1991, the hammer and sickle comes down from the Kremlin for the last time. Communism, 70 years, never mind. Who would have ever dreamed that possible? Or that in a place like Birmingham, Alabama, where a little girl couldn't have a hamburger at the Woolworth's lunch counter, but her parents had her convinced that she could be president of the United States, and by the way, she became Secretary of State. You know, America has a way of making it happen.
Let me open it up. Please. Raise your, yes, Dan.
Madam Secretary, thanks. Great to see you again.
Good to
And
see you,
last time we were only speaking about foreign affairs and your duties, and I thought you seemed very busy up until the end of your time of the Bush administration, the State Department. How did this book come about? And may I say, so quickly, and please explain the second version, the young adult version.
Yes,
Did
yes.
you edit? How did that work?
Right. Well, let me take that first. There's an adult version, a young adult version. What we did with the young adult version is to put a greater emphasis up front on my younger life, my time with my parents. It's condensed considerably. It's moved around so that it appeals more to young people who might be less interested in Condi as provost at Stanford, for instance. But I hope that by having this version, which I love with my parents. By the way, this is taken after I've received an award at the University of Denver for the Outstanding Senior Woman, or Miss DU, as it was called a couple years before that when people weren't so politically correct. And then this one, which I hope will appeal to kids because I think she's kind of cute, this little girl. Yeah. But as to why...
I hope you left out that having to go to school at age 3 part from the young adult.
Right. The question of how the book came about, when you're winding down and you're thinking about what you want to say about your experiences, with every improbable event that I went through, whether it was negotiating with Israelis and Palestinians, or a plane behind me that just said the United States of America, or going off to be the first Secretary of State to see Muammar Gaddafi, I kept thinking, how did this all happen? How did this little girl end up being Secretary of State? And when people asked me that question, as they frequently did, I always said, you had to know John and Angelina Rice. And so this book is really my story through John and Angelina Rice's story, and I wanted people to have that prelude. The book ends in 2000, or the beginning of 2001, as I leave for the White House, because ironically, my mother died in 1985. My father died on December 24th, 2000. And I left for Washington about 8 days after that. And so it was a kind of perfect bookend to that chapter.
And I take it the next book will be your memoirs of
The next book is memoirs
power.
about the last 8 years.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Right.
By the way, these books are for sale. Will you sign them afterwards?
Of course,
okay,
I'd be
well,
happy to.
this is a truly great gift. Please, speak up. Yes, in the way back there. Is that Dave Jackson? Or no, it's Romesh Ratnazar, a student of
yes, former student
a
of
former student of
Secretary Rice, it's great to see you again,
Good to see
and
you, Ramesh.
thank you for your service to our country and for this wonderful book, which I just finished yesterday. I have a question about something that Walter touched on, and I know it's something you've thought about quite a bit over the years, and that is the struggle of the Republican Party to expand its base and broaden its appeal to African Americans and other minorities. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why you think that remains such a problem for the Republicans, and also whether you believe that some of the rhetoric used against President Obama by some of his critics has made it more difficult to appeal to blacks and other minorities.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the Republican Party, and I talk about this in the book, look, there's a history with the Republican Party that was an unfortunate history from my point of view. The Southern strategy in 1964 and appealing to white Southerners who were disenchanted by desegregation, and that history is there. But frankly, I don't think either party has a complete option on whether or not we've dealt well with race relations. I think on both sides of the aisle there have been problems. I think the Republican Party hasn't always spoken in a way that highlights those elements of, if to the degree that there is a Republican ideology or a Republican set of principles of values, why those values are important for minorities. As an example, education reform. One of the things that really attracted me to George W. Bush was when he talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Right.
I myself have seen and felt the soft bigotry of low expectations, where people look at you as a minority and they just assume they know that you've either been disadvantaged or you're not quite as good or you're not quite as smart, and then they get all kind of patronizing about it and then they want to help you and oh please, right? And if you're not careful, that's much underlying the problem in the K-12 education system today. That unlike my very segregated schools in Birmingham, Alabama, where there were high expectations and no excuses and no victims, this creation of a class of little victims who say, well, after all, I'm black, what can you expect, is, I think, one of the outgrowths of too much identity politics. Now, I think that that's actually an argument that could appeal to black Americans and other minorities, but maybe the Republican Party doesn't make it in a way that is there. You also have to say, you know, the two black secretaries of state, Republican. And so I always was very sad that President Bush, who I knew that one of the things he was most proud of was that he got a very high percentage of the black vote in Texas and a very high percentage of the Hispanic vote, that was a president that somehow people couldn't see. As to the rhetoric about President Obama, look, there's some crazy things being said out there on the extremes, and unfortunately, just the pace of the news with 24-hour cable and people keep repeating things, and frankly, the internet that's not always reliable as a source of information, I think the volume in our politics has gotten really loud. And the problem in a system like ours, where the Founding Fathers intended our institutions actually not to work very fast or very well, they separated powers. You need time in politics to let people come to consensus. People shouldn't get backed into a corner with a microphone shoved into their face so that once they've established a position, they can't move. And so the politics has gotten loud and rough, although our politics has always been a little bit rough. And I don't like some of the things that I hear said. But frankly, I didn't like it when people said that President Bush was a racist and therefore he allowed Katrina to happen to black people. You know, I didn't like that either. So our politics has been kind of nasty on this count for a long time, and we would do ourselves very well to back off explanations of he's a racist, she's a racist, they're a racist, because there is no deeper wound in the United States than race. Started with our birth defect of slavery, has gone through our deep wounds of segregation and prejudice, and when you level that charge, you'd better know what you're talking about, because you're touching an emotional hot button that you can't pull back.
Yeah, you talk about the rhetoric that's now being directed against Obama on that he you know, is on the wrong side of the war, you know, of Islam, or that he's a Muslim. Do you want to help walk that rhetoric back for yourself?
I would hope that
having met with him today.
Well, and not just having met with him today. You know, there's nothing in this presidency that would suggest that this president is anything but a defender of America's interest and the American identity. There's nothing that would suggest that. And America, by the way, is also not an Islamophobic country. I wasn't very pleased, and I'll just say it, I can now say whatever, I wasn't very pleased with that Time magazine cover. Is America Islamophobic?
Oh, okay.
No. The United States of America is the most tolerant country on the face of the earth for all people. I know, you know, we've been out there. And yes, there are extremes in any country and in any place that hold those views. But the great majority of Americans, particularly because their neighbors are Muslim, their kids go to school with Muslims, even in places that you might not expect it, like Birmingham, Alabama. And for the most part, we get along just fine. And so I think extremes sometimes get a louder megaphone, whether it's saying things that are outrageous about President Obama or saying things that are outrageous about the United States.
Yes.
Madam Secretary.
Whoops.
Go ahead.
Hi. I was wondering if you could say something about your experience as Secretary of State during a time when economic policy became more important on the global stage.
Yes. Thank you for that question, because I think it's not often realized that secretaries of state spend a lot of time on the things that you expect, the Middle East peace, North Korea, Iran. They also spend a lot of time tussling with foreign ministers and heads of state about opening their markets for American beef. Or the more than 30-minute conversation that I had with Vladimir Putin, in which I explained that in fact trichinosis had not been found in American pork except but in 5 cases, and it was not actually related to pork, and he told me that that was because Russians cook their pork differently than Americans. I mean, this is honestly a conversation that we had when I was advocating for opening markets to American pork. The reason and again, the person with my Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, Reuben Jeffrey, is here. And I think he can attest to the fact that the Secretary of State carries a huge economic portfolio. And in part, that's because in a world in which economic power is really the essential ingredient, you need military power, you need all of those things. But where you stand in the global economy, and can you compete, and are you going to advocate for free trade, and are your people confident enough to advocate to accept free trade? These are all essentials of power in the international system. And so I spent a good deal of time on economic issues, intellectual property issues with China, for instance. And I know that Secretary Clinton is spending a good deal of time on those issues too. The other thing that I think the United States has learned to do better through the State Department, through the embassies, is to advocate for American business abroad. We never advocated when there was a competition between 2 American companies, but if there was an American company in competition with a foreign company, then we did advocate on behalf of that company, and I think that's wholly appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Valerie, did you want to say something, make another comment? Okay,
Thank you for the
yeah, sure. Yes.
Hi, great. Hi, Secretary Rice. Great to see you. My question is on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which was certainly part of your portfolio, and I won't ask you whether or not you discussed that with President Obama, but I'm sure you did. The Arab Peace Initiative was introduced in the Arab League meeting in Lebanon in 2002, and, you know, what was the future of that during the Bush administration, and what do you think the future of that is now? Because now it really is an extraordinary document that could be useful to get both parties back to the table.
I actually think the Arab Peace Initiative has a lot of value in exactly that way, and actually, if you look back, every document that we actually used during the Bush administration, we put the Arab Peace Initiative as a part of it, including the Annapolis Declaration, where the Arab Peace Initiative is mentioned. The problem in 2002 was there was a raging intifada. And Ariel Sharon had not been brought to power to make peace with the Palestinians. He had been brought to power to defeat the Intifada. And so there wasn't much room for the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002. I think, though, that the last several years, 3 fundamentals have changed in a positive way for the 2-state solution. First of all, because of what Salam Fayyad and Mahmoud Abbas have been able to do in the West Bank, and Walter and the Aspen Institute were a part of that, with good security forces, which the United States, by the way, funded and helped train. Good security forces, rapid economic growth in the West Bank, institutions that are functioning in the West Bank, you can actually see what a Palestinian state might look like. Yeah. And Israelis used to always say, but there's no partner for peace on the other side. Well, there is. It's that Fatah, West Bank, democratic Palestinian leadership. Secondly, I think the range of Israelis who now believe in a 2-state solution has broadened considerably. In 2000 at Camp David, it was Ehud Barak and Labor. Then, by 2003, it was Ariel Sharon who said there could be a 2-state solution. Then it was Ehud Olmert, who, by the way, made a pretty good offer to Mahmoud Abbas, but Olmert by that time had political troubles, legal troubles. And now Benjamin Netanyahu says, yes, 2-state solution. So broad Israeli support, yes, the far right in Israel not there, but much broader than in 2000. And finally, the Arabs themselves, who I think now really want to solve this problem, because they figured out that there's a problem in the Middle East, and it starts with an I, but it's not Israel. It's Iran. And they would like to solve this problem because the Iranians play in troubled waters. That really bad Hamas in Gaza is Iranian-backed. It's not even Syrian-backed. It's Iranian-backed. So I think the fundamentals are there. And if we can get them at the table and keep them at the table, the solution ought to be in sight. The one problem is that the Palestinians themselves are going to finally have to take a deal. I used to tell President Abbas, for whom I have enormous respect, I just think the world of him, but I used to say, you know, you should have taken the deal in 48, should have taken the deal in 67, should have taken the deal in 2000, should take the deal in 2008, because every time you don't take a deal, your state gets smaller, and pretty soon it's going to be the size of the White House if you're not careful. And so sooner or later, the Palestinians are going to have to say to their people, there isn't going to be the return of 4 million refugees to Israel. That will be taken care of in the Palestinian state. They're going to have to say, we're going to have to agree that sovereignty in Jerusalem is going to have to be shared sovereignty. And they're going to have to swallow hard and recognize that those settlements that look like cities are going to stay in the state of Israel. And there can be compensation in the way of swaps. But Malo Adamim is not going anywhere. Ariel needs to be reconfigured, but it's not going anywhere. And no Israeli prime minister can afford to dismantle settlements that have now become cities. A lot of settlements will be dismantled, but not those. And the Bush letter to Ariel Sharon in 2004 that said, population realities on the ground will have to be recognized, spoke to that. Then I think you'll get a solution.
Well, I want to offer you the chance to give some final words, especially about how you see a consensus that could happen in foreign policy, maybe after the midterms, with to take away this poison.
Well, look, I think we all want the same things. We want to be safer and secure after 9/11. We want our military forces to be able to come home with honor, with stronger states in Iraq and Afghanistan than we found there. We know that Afghanistan, where I think the president, by the way, has taken some very courageous decisions, Afghanistan was always going to be hard. Right? It's the 5th poorest country in the world. It's tough, but we have to remember that at least women aren't being executed in stadiums by the Taliban, and women are going to school, and Al-Qaeda isn't able to have free run of that country like they once did. And we have to advocate for a decent Afghanistan, which ultimately will make us more secure. And we all want, of course, to deal with the threat of proliferation in Iran and North Korea and so forth. And we all want to rebuild the global economy. But I think the place that we as Americans need to come together more than anything is not so much about what we would characterize as those foreign policy issues, but about what has made the United States the leader that it has been for all of these years, and reaffirming our commitment to that. Now, when you're Secretary of State, you get to go out and you get to see what people like about us and what they don't. And sometimes they fear our military power. They might even resent it, but they're awfully glad, that there's an American military that volunteers to do the hard work at the front lines. And sometimes our economic power is resented, and particularly our cultural penetration. I mean, how many MTV stations can there be in the world? But the one thing that is universally admired is what some of you have perhaps even heard me call our great national myth. And that's the log cabin. It doesn't matter where you came from, matters where you're going. You can come from humble circumstances, you can do great things. And that's actually caused people to want to come here, the most ambitious people, to want to come here and be a part of that for generations. And I mean ambitious people at the low end who want to make $5, not 50 cents, and Sergey Brin's parents who come here when he's 7 and he founds Google. And it's this country of immigrants that has invited and brought these people who refresh us and make us better, and by the way, keep us from the sclerotic demographics of Europe and the tragic demographics of Russia, we're a country of immigrants. And when I hear people say that maybe we ought to deny citizenship to the children of illegal immigrants, I think, what country am I living in? I'm very sad that we weren't able to get comprehensive immigration reform, because when you have a bill that George W. Bush, John McCain, and Ted Kennedy all want, and you can't get it through, you know how easy it is to demagogue this issue. But one of the reasons that people are frightened about immigration is that they also know that that other part of it, that if you were born here, it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going, is under siege. And there, my parents' story, my grandparents' story, that education was going to be the armor against everything bad. Education was going to be the way to assure a productive life. That's really what people are fearful of now, because when I can look at your zip code and tell whether or not you can get a good education, something is desperately wrong. And so I think some work on the fundamentals of who we are, private sector-led growth, fiscal responsibility, but most importantly, country of immigrants, a country where everybody can get a decent education, that will give us the confidence as Americans to lead. And if we're not confident and optimistic as we have always been, I can assure you that the opposite will happen. We will turn inward, we will try to protect, others will out-protect us because they always can, and we will lose in that bargain. And what is more, the world will lose, because I always end my remarks by saying the following: the world is very lucky that the freest and most compassionate and most generous country on the face of the earth is also the most powerful.
Awesome. Very inspiring. Really.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you for doing the book.
Thank you.
The book is for sale. And if anybody doesn't buy it now, they have a very hard heart.
Yeah.